the 11th of October 1976. The cold, dense air over the Baltic Sea. Soviet Air Defense Forces Captain Valery Zuyev gripped the controls of his Mi-23 mm flogger. He was flying at less than 300 feet, a grey shadow racing over the churning grey waves. His mission was simple: a probe. Fly fast and low towards Danish airspace, test the NATO reaction time, trigger their radars, and then peel away. Zuyev was a product of the PVO, the Protivovozdushnaya Oborona. His entire training was built on a single, immutable truth. The ground was his shield. Radar, as every pilot knew, was a game of line of sight. An enemy radar high above, looking down, would be instantly blinded by the massive, overwhelming return from the Earth itself. The ground was a million-ton mirror of electronic noise. To find a single, fast-moving fighter jet inside that ground clutter was a technical impossibility. This impossibility was the core of Soviet air doctrine. Their attack planes, the Sukhoi Su-17 seconds and Mi-27 seconds, were designed to hug the terrain, to become one with the hills and valleys. And Zuyev, in his advanced interceptor, used the same tactic to mask his approach. He was invisible. He was a ghost. His radar, the Sapphire 2-3, was powerful, but it had the same limitation. It could scan the sky above him for high-altitude bombers, but if he pointed it down, his scope would simply bloom with white noise. This was a law of physics. It was a law that applied to his enemies as well. The American F-4 Phantoms, the British Lightnings, they were all blind to the world below them. Zuyev's cockpit was a cramped, utilitarian space of turquoise-painted metal and glowing analog dials. He checked his course. He was 30 miles from NATO airspace. Any second now, he expected his Berioza radar warning receiver, the small cathode ray tube with its glowing pips, to light up, showing that a distant ground radar on the island of Bornholm had finally detected him. Instead, a different sound filled his helmet. It was a high, piercing, continuous tone, a lock. Zuyev's blood ran cold. This was not the pulsing chirp of a long-range search radar. This was the terrifying solid squeal of a fire control system that had already acquired him. It was a sound that meant a missile was seconds away from launch. His training took over. He snapped the MiG into a brutal high-G bank, dumping flares and chaff, a desperate cloud of aluminum and magnesium to decoy a missile. He scanned the sky. Nothing. He scanned his mirrors. Nothing. The tone remained, unbroken, screaming in his ear. He looked up. There, against the deep, substratospheric blue, was a single, tiny contrail. It was impossibly high. 30, maybe 40,000 feet, a tiny silver dot. The lock was coming from above him. This was not just impossible, it was a violation of reality. A fighter jet high above could not see him, let alone lock him while he was buried in the ground clutter. Zuyev was a fish at the bottom of a murky ocean, and something, some eagle in the sun, was staring right at him. He broke off the probe, firewalling the throttle and turning his flogger back east, the warning tone chasing him all the way. He landed at his base in Kaliningrad, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unstrap his helmet. His report to his political officer was met with skepticism. Hysteria, perhaps? Equipment malfunction? But within weeks, another pilot reported the same thing. And then another. A ghost was haunting the Baltic. A predator that hunted from above, that had somehow broken the laws of physics. That predator, they would soon learn, was the new American F-15 Eagle. And its existence didn't just render a single tactic obsolete. It rendered the entire Soviet air defense philosophy a catastrophic, horrifying failure. The shock that Captain Zuyev experienced was not an accident. It was the result of a profound humiliation and a revolutionary shift in American design philosophy. If this story of technological dominance is one you want to follow, subscribe to Cold War Impact to see how these events unfolded. To understand why the F-15 was such a terrifying conceptual leap, one must first understand the confidence and the arrogance of the Soviet system in the early 1970s. The Soviet Union's air doctrine was fundamentally defensive, built on the hard-won lessons of the Great Patriotic War. Their airspace was protected by a vast, layered, and integrated system. On the ground, the PVO deployed thousands of surface-to-air missiles, from the high-altitude SA-2 seconds that had downed Gary Power's U-2 to the newer, more mobile SA-6 seconds. In the air, a fleet of dedicated, high-speed interceptors, like the MiG-25 Foxbat, patrolled the stratosphere, built for one purpose: to fly in a straight line, very fast, and shoot down lumbering American B-52 bombers. But for the tactical, frontline air war, Soviet doctrine was aggressive. It was about prizemny ground-hugging. They had watched the Americans in Vietnam with great interest. They saw the F-4 Phantom, a powerful beast of a fighter, struggle. The Phantom was a bomber interceptor, forced into a dogfighter's role. Its early missiles, the AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder, were notoriously unreliable. Its engines smoked, giving it away from miles off. And, most importantly, its Westinghouse APQ-120 radar was a clumsy, analog system that was completely and totally blind to anything below it. A Vietnamese MiG-17 or MiG-21 pilot, flying low, was invisible to the phantoms above. The American pilots had to visually acquire their targets, tally-ho, and dive down to engage in a classic, close-range turning fight, a fight their heavy, unmaneuverable jet was not designed for. Soviet tacticians absorbed this. The lesson was clear: altitude is a vulnerability, and the ground is a sanctuary. They built their entire Warsaw Pact invasion plan around this. Tens of thousands of tanks would pour through the Fulda Gap, and flying cover just overhead, immune to the F-4 seconds above them, would be hundreds of Mi-23 seconds, Mi-27 seconds, and Su-17 seconds, acting as a tactical spearhead. This was their fortress, a fortress built on the bedrock belief in the limitations of radar. Meanwhile, America was reeling. The Vietnam experience had been a traumatic shock. The missile-age hubris of the 1950s, the belief that dogfighting was over, had been proven disastrously wrong. A generation of pilots had been lost. The Air Force and Navy knew they had a profound problem. Their premier fighter, the F-4, was being outmaneuvered by older, simpler MiGs, and its technology was failing. In 1968, the Air Force greenlit a program to build its replacement. It was not to be an interceptor or a fighter bomber. It was to be a fighter, experimental, or FX. The goal was not incremental improvement. The goal was total, unquestioned, and absolute air superiority. The contract was won by McDonnell Douglas. Their creation was the F-15 Eagle. From the outside, it was a masterpiece of aerodynamic design. A massive blended wing body, two powerful Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines that, for the first time, produced more thrust than the aircraft itself weighed. It could climb vertically, accelerating as it went. It was a hot rod, a true dogfighter, built to win the close-in knife fight that the F-4 kept losing. But the true revolution was not in the airframe, it was buried in the nose cone. The Phantom that had haunted Captain Zuyev was not a plane, it was a system. It was the Hughes Aircraft APG-63 radar. And it was the world's first true look-down, divided by shoot-down radar in an operational fighter. This was the solution to the American problem. The APG-63 was not an analog system. It was a digital, programmable, pulse Doppler radar. The concept of pulse Doppler is complex, but its battlefield application was brutal and simple. An old radar, like the F-4's, just sent out a ping and waited for the pong. It measured distance, but when it looked down, the pong it got back from the ground was 1 billion times stronger than the pong from a tiny MiG, completely drowning it in clutter. A pulse Doppler radar does not just measure distance, it measures velocity. It sends out its pulse and then measures the Doppler shift of the return, the same principle that makes a train whistle change pitch as it passes you. The APG-63 was programmed with a simple, brilliant piece of logic. The ground, relative to the F-15, is not moving. It has a velocity of 0. But a Soviet MiG-23, flying at 500 knots, has a very high velocity. The F-15's digital processor simply filtered out all signals that had a velocity of 0. The ground clutter vanished. The impossible was suddenly possible. For an F-15 pilot, flying at 40,000 feet, the world below was no longer an opaque mirror of noise. It was a crystal-clear, God's-eye view. He could see everything. He could see the MiG-23 hugging the waves. He could see the Su-17 seconds in the valleys. He could see the helicopters skimming the trees. And with the newly reliable AIM-7 Farad Sparrow missile, what he could see, he could kill. This single piece of technology rendered 20 years of Soviet air doctrine billions of rubles in aircraft development, and the training of an entire generation of pilots utterly obsolete. The sanctuary was gone. The fortress had been breached. The ghost was real. And the Soviet pilots who had to fly against it were, for the first time, truly horrified. The game had changed, and they had not even been told it had begun. The collision was not a single, dramatic dogfight. It was a slow, agonizing, and systemic humiliation that unfolded over months. Captain Zuyev's report, filed in Kaliningrad, was initially buried. A phantom lock was a contradiction in terms. It was categorized as an AN divided by APQ 120 failure, a bleed-through from the F-4's powerful but clumsy radar. The political officer suggested Zuyev was rattled by the new American pirate warning systems, simple receivers designed to pretend to be a lock, to scare pilots into breaking off their runs. But the reports kept coming. From the Baltic, from the borders of West Germany, from the high north, over the Barents Sea. Soviet pilots, all flying low-level probe missions, all reported the same terrifying, impossible phenomenon, a solid, unwavering lock from an unseen enemy high above. The PVO High Command in Moscow could not ignore the pattern. This was not equipment failure. This was a new, coordinated tactic, a new weapon. The order went out. Hunt it. The humiliation began in earnest. The PVO activated its full integrated air defense network. This was the system they had spent a decade and billions of rubles perfecting. Long-range Tall King radars scanned the stratosphere. SAM batteries were put on high alert, and elite interceptor squadrons were scrambled, not just with their standard MiG-23 seconds, but with their prized possession, the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-25 Foxbat. Imagine a Soviet command bunker near Murmansk, 1970s. It is a cavern of concrete, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and ozone. Men in blue-grey uniforms move markers across a massive, backlit plexiglass map of Northern Europe. A controller, his voice, a strained monotone, speaks into his headset. Vector 205, target estimated. Angels 40. In the sky, a pair of MiG-25 seconds ignite their massive Tumansky R-15 turbines. These are not fighters, they are rockets with fins, built of nickel steel to withstand the heat of Mach 3. Their sole purpose is to climb to the edge of space and destroy the American SR-71 Blackbird. Now, they are being used to hunt this new high-altitude ghost. The pilots, encased in pressure suits, firewall their throttles. They are a fast pair, rocketing to 60,000 feet. Their powerful Smerch, radars, the most powerful airborne radars in the world, scanning a cone of sky in front of them. Their scopes are empty, absolutely nothing. Then, in both cockpits, the Berioza RWRs light up, screaming their solid, high-pitched tone. They are being locked. The pilots are stunned. They are at 60,000 feet, flying at Mach 2.5. They are the apex predators. Nothing is above them, save for the SR-71, which carries no weapons. Nothing is faster, yet the lock holds. The controller in the bunker sees it on his data link. The ghost is not at Angels 40. It is not even close. It is 50 miles west, orbiting at 30,000 feet below them, and it is tracking them perfectly. The MiG-25 seconds, low on fuel from their high-speed climb, are forced to break off. They descend, defeated. The moment they drop below 40,000 feet, the lock tone vanishes. The ghost has let them go. Now, shift perspective. The cockpit of an F-15 Eagle, 510th Tactical Fighter Squadron, flying a Barrier Combat Air Patrol, BARCAP, out of Ramstein, West Germany. The pilot is a young major, call sign Blade. His world is not the cramped, turquoise-painted chaos of the MiG. His is a wide, open bubble canopy, a floating armchair with 360-degree visibility. And in front of him is the pale green glow of the APG-63's vertical situation display. He is not hunched over, squinting at a noisy, raw datascope. He is looking at a processed, symbolic data screen. His radar is in track-while-scan mode. It is scanning a 60-degree cone of airspace, 100 miles out, from the ground up to 60,000 feet. He sees everything. His headphones are calm. Blade, you have a pair of bogies, 090, 80 miles, climbing fast, looks like foxbats. Roger, Blade replies. He doesn't even move the aircraft. His thumb moves on the throttle quadrant, designating the two climbing targets. His radar locks them both, while still scanning the rest of the sector. He watches them on his scope. Two small squares climbing, with velocity vectors appearing next to them. They rocket past his altitude. He sees their radar energy light up his own warning receiver. Blade, they're searching high. Looks like they're looking for, well, us. Roger. No joy. They're in the blind. Blade and his wingman just orbit, calm. They are the silent sentinels. The Foxbat pilots, in their desperate, high-speed, high-altitude dash, are completely blind to the two eagles orbiting placidly, 50 miles away, and 30,000 feet below them, watching their every move. The F-15 seconds are not just planes. They are airborne command centers. They are the eyes of NATO. The Soviet pilots are not just outflown. They are out, thought, outseen and out, classed by a system they cannot even comprehend. This was the true humiliation. It was not a battle. It was an observation. The PVO was thrashing. They were scrambling fighters, activating SAM sites, burning tons of fuel, all in response to a shadow. The Americans, in their F-15 seconds, were simply watching them do it. The psychological impact on the Soviet pilot corps was corrosive. The sky, their sky, was no longer theirs. Their training was useless. Their ground-hugging tactics, their primary offensive and defensive maneuver, was now a death sentence. To fly low was to paint yourself as a target for an enemy you could not see, could not hear, and could not fight. It was, as one defecting pilot would later describe it, an act of profound contempt. The Americans were not just proving their technology was better, they were proving that Soviet doctrine was a lie. They were demonstrating that they owned the sky, from the stratosphere to the treetops. The PVO could launch its entire air force, and the F-15 seconds would simply track them, categorize them, and decide, with cold, clinical precision, which ones were worth a missile, and which ones were simply worth watching. This was the collision, not of metal but of doctrines, and the sound of the impact was the unbroken, screaming tone in a Soviet pilot's helmet, the sound of his own and his nation's utter helplessness. The humiliation was not isolated. It was refined, weaponized, and turned into a system. The sporadic, terrifying encounters of 1976 and 1977 soon settled into a horrifying new normal. The F-15 Eagle, with its all-seeing APG-63 radar, was not a specialized silver bullet weapon. It was the new frontline standard. By the end of the 1970s, hundreds of them were based across Europe at Ramstein and Spangdahlem in West Germany, at Soesterberg in the Netherlands, at Bitburg and at Keflavik in Iceland, guarding the crucial Guke Gap. The impossible encounter was no longer a shock. It was a daily, grinding reality. The Americans stopped just probing. They began to loiter. They established 24/7 barrier combat air patrols along the Iron Curtain, the border between East and West Germany. These were not panicked scrambles. They were routine, 8-hour sorties where F-15 seconds would orbit at 30,000 feet, their radars silently scanning deep into Warsaw-packed airspace. The PVO and Frontal Aviation Command posts began to see the pattern. Their long-range ground radars would detect the F-15 seconds, high and fast, taking up their stations. But that detection was meaningless. The F-15 seconds wanted to be seen on ground radar. It was a statement. It was the electronic equivalent of a Roman legionary planting his standard on a hilltop, daring the barbarians below to attack. The F-15 seconds were the sentinels, but the system was larger. The true nightmare began when the Eagles were networked with a new American asset, the E-3 Sentry, the AWACS. The AWACS, with its massive rotating dome, was a flying command post. Its own look-down radar was so powerful it could monitor every aircraft, from the ground to the stratosphere, in a radius of over 250 miles. It didn't just see the MiGs, it saw the F-15 seconds too. It was the conductor. The F-15 pilots no longer even needed to use their own radars. They could fly in total electronic silence, emitting nothing, invisible to Soviet warning receivers. The AWACS would see the low-level Soviet probe, and the controller, his voice calm, would simply vector the silent F-15 seconds into a perfect, high-altitude ambush position. The Soviet pilot, hugging the terrain, would feel safe. His Berioza receiver was quiet. And then, At the last possible second, the F-15 pilot, now directly overhead and just 20 miles away, would switch his APG-63 from silent to active, acquiring an instant unbreakable lock. For the MiG pilot, it was teleportation. A ghost appearing from nowhere, its missile-lock tone the first and last warning he would ever receive. This system was proven in a series of routine, brutal, and entirely one-sided exercises that were, in reality, psychological operations. Consider the Baltic Express. This was a routine Soviet maneuver practiced monthly. A pair of Tu-16 Badger bombers, escorted by 4 MiG-23 floggers, would fly from the Kola Peninsula, sweeping down the Baltic Sea at low altitude to simulate a cruise missile strike on NATO's Danish Straits. In October 1978, they ran the Express. The 6 Soviet aircraft were flying at 500 feet, just above the Whitecaps. The sea clutter, they believed, made them invisible. High above, at 35,000 feet, was a single F-15 Eagle from the 57th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, based in Iceland. His call sign was Viking 1. He wasn't even on a dedicated intercept, he was simply transiting. His APG-63, in its long-range search mode, picked them up from 90 miles away. The F-15 pilot watched them on his scope. 6 green pips crawling over the digital noise of the sea. He saw the bombers, he saw their escorts. He could even discern their formation. He tracked while scanning, designating all 6 as hostile in his system. He watched them for 20 minutes. His jet, a single silent contrail against the Sunday. He descended slightly, came within simulated missile range, and his system killed all 6 aircraft without ever being detected. He then climbed away and continued on his flight plan. The Soviet crews landed, completely unaware that for the last half of their mission they had been dead. The only record of the engagement was a data tape removed from the F-15's avionics bay to be studied by tacticians at Langley. The Soviet pilot's confidence was based on a lie, and the Americans knew it. Then there was the Fulda Gap pressure test. This was not subtle. During a major 1979 Warsaw Pact exercise, a full regiment of Su-17 fitters was tasked with a simulated low-level strike on a West German choke point. This was the spear tip. This was the core of their entire offensive doctrine. The moment they crossed the border in their exercise box, 2 full squadrons of F-15 seconds from Bitburg, vectored by an AWACS, descended upon them from above. This time, the Americans did not stay silent. In the cockpits of 40 Soviet aircraft, the world ended. Every single pilot's radar warning receiver shrieked the solid, unbearable lock tone simultaneously, not from one direction but from all quadrants. The sky above them had turned into a solid wall of hostile radar energy. The Soviet formation broke. Pilots, gripped by pure instinctive panic, dumped flares and chaff, yanking their aircraft into desperate, uncoordinated turns. They scattered, diving for the trees, some nearly colliding. The entire spear-tip strike, the central pillar of a Warsaw Pact ground offensive, had been shattered in less than 30 seconds by an enemy no one had even seen. The F-15 seconds just watched, their pilots noting the fuel states and panic vectors of the scattering MiGs, before calmly turning back to their patrol stations. This systematic failure gave birth to the haunting symbol of this new American dominance. It was not a sonic boom, it was not a sleek black airframe. It was the green eye. This became the term Soviet pilots used, in hushed, bitter tones, in their debriefing rooms and mess halls. It was the pale green, phosphorescent glow of the American radar scope. The green eye was a symbol of an indifferent, technological god. It was an eye that could see through the ground clutter. It could see through the darkness. It could see through the fog. It turned the very terrain, the pilot's oldest and most trusted ally, into a treacherous liability. This symbol became a corrosive psychological weapon, more potent than any missile. A Soviet pilot climbing into his MiG-23 knew with cold certainty that he was no longer a hunter, he was prey. He knew that the moment his wheels left the runway, he was almost certainly appearing as a symbolic blip on a screen, in an air-conditioned cockpit, 5 miles above him. He knew that his skill, his training, his Red Eagle status was irrelevant. He could not fly a circuit board. He could not outmaneuver a Doppler filter. This green eye was omnipresent. It was the eye in the sky that haunted their every mission. It forced the PVO to fly shorter, more predictable routes. It forced them to cancel exercises. It grounded wings for maintenance issues that were, in reality, crippling morale failures. The F-15's radar didn't just win a technological battle, it won a psychological war. It established a no-fly zone over the Warsaw Pact's own territory. The Americans proved that they could not just win a war, they could prevent one, simply by making the cost of the first move so totally, catastrophically, and undeniably unwinnable. The green eye was a verdict, delivered before the trial had even begun, and it always found the guilty. The Fulda Gap pressure test of 1979 was not just an embarrassment, it was a strategic cataclysm. The data from that exercise reports of 40 panicked pilots scattering, of a full strike regiment rendered combat ineffective in seconds landed on desks at the highest levels of the Soviet state. This was no longer a problem for the PVO. This was a problem for the Politburo. In the grey, wood-panelled halls of the Kremlin, the realization dawned. The green eye of the F-15 was not merely a new piece of hardware, it was an ideological weapon. It proved that the entire Warsaw Pact invasion plan, the massive, tank-heavy, deep battle doctrine that was the cornerstone of Soviet military power in Europe, was a fantasy. It was built on a lie. The lie was that their low-flying strike aircraft, their Su-17 seconds and MiG-27 seconds, could survive to support the tank columns. The F-15, orbiting with impunity, had proven they could not. The spear tip could be, and would be, shattered before it ever reached its target. This triggered a wave of desperation within the Soviet High Command. The Minister of Defense, Dmitry Ustinov, and the heads of the aviation design bureaus were summoned. The order was not polite, it was absolute. Solve this. Give us our own Eagle. This became the Soviet Union's great, frantic countermeasure. It was their big bet. It was not a single aircraft, but a sweeping, ruinously expensive program to create a fourth generation of fighters. The effort was split. The Sukhoi Bureau was tasked with the heavy fighter, a direct, no-compromise answer to the F-15. This would become the Su-27 flanker. The McCoy and Gurevich Bureau was tasked with the light fighter, a more numerous, cheaper, point defense, equivalent to the F-16. This would become the MiG-29 Fulcrum. The core of this entire multi-billion ruble bet was not the airframe. The Soviets could build powerful engines and sleek, maneuverable jets. The bet was on whether they could replicate the impossible American system, the look-down divided by shoot-down radar. Could Soviet industry, a system built on copying, reverse engineering, and brute force production, innovate its way to a digital pulse Doppler radar? Could they create their own green eye? The task fell to the Fazatron and Tikhomirov design bureaus. They were given unlimited resources. They were given the fragments of data gleaned from their own pilots' terrifying encounters. And, most importantly, they were given the Holy Grail, intelligence. In 1976, a 2-3-year-old defense contractor employee in California named Andrew Dalton Lee, with his friend Christopher Boyce, sold a trove of top-secret documents to the KGB. Among them, allegedly, were technical manuals and data concerning the APG-63 radar. And in 1980, the Polish intelligence agent Zdzisław Przychodzian delivered technical details of the F-15's AIM-7 Farads Sparrow missile. The Soviets now had the answer key. They had the theory. The countermeasure was to build a copy. The MiG-29 would be equipped with the Phasatron N-19 slot-back radar. The Su-27 would get the Tikhomirov N-1 mech radar. On paper, the problem was solved. These new radars, they were promised, would have the same look-down capability as the F-15. These new fighters, with their incredible Cobra maneuverability, would be more than a match for the Eagle. And yet it failed. The countermeasure was a catastrophic failure, not of aerodynamics, but of economics, electronics, and most importantly, time. The failure was rooted in the fundamental flaw of the command economy. First, the technical truth. The Soviets, even with the stolen plans, could not manufacture the American technology. The APG-63 was built on a foundation of revolutionary digital microprocessors. The F-15 was, in essence, a flying computer. The Soviet electronics industry, by contrast, was in the dark ages. They were still reliant on bulky, less reliable analog systems and vacuum tubes. When they tried to copy the American digital architecture, the result was a crude, oversized, and buggy imitation. The MiG-29's N-19 slot-back radar was a disaster. It was plagued with reliability problems. Its look-down capability was a fraction of the APG-63's. It could only track a single target at a time, not the track-while scan of 10 or more that the Eagle managed. Its range was pathetic. It could often see no further than the pilot's own eyeball. The Su-27's mech radar was better, but still lagged years behind. The first-generation Soviet look-down divided by shoot-down was, in practice, look-down divided by glimpse and fail. While Soviet engineers struggled to mimic the computer, American engineers were perfecting it. By the time the first MiG-29 seconds rolled out, the F-15 was already receiving its C-model upgrade, with a vastly improved APG-70 radar, a fully digital engine control system, and an avionics suite that was light years ahead. The Soviets weren't just in a different league, they were playing a different sport. They showed up with a musket to a laser tag fight. This brings us to the killer statistic. It is not about missiles, it is about time. The McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle achieved initial operational capability with the United States Air Force in 1976. The Mikoyan MiG-29 Fulcrum, the Soviets' premier lightweight answer, officially entered service in 1982. That is a 6-year gap. But that date is a piece of paper-pushing propaganda. The aircraft was not available in meaningful numbers, and the N-19 radar was not even remotely functional until the mid-1980s. The heavy Su-27, the true F-15 competitor, did not enter service until 1985. For nearly a full decade, the United States Air Force possessed a capability that the Soviet Union could not counter, could not match, and could not even understand. For 10 years, every single Warsaw Pact pilot who flew a low-level mission did so at the complete and total mercy of the Green Eye orbiting miles above. The F-15 owned the skies of Europe for the entire second half of the Cold War. This decade-long gap was the psychological toll. It was a cancer on the morale of the Soviet High Command. They had spent hundreds of billions of rubles, strained their entire economy, and stolen the enemy's own blueprints, only to produce a flawed, unreliable copy, 10 years too late. The F-15 had held the Warsaw Pact at gunpoint for a decade. The MiG-29 was the equivalent of showing up to the duel a day after it had already been lost. This was the true impact of the Eagle. It didn't just win the air-to-air battle, it bankrupted the enemy's ability to even try to fight it. It forced the Soviet Union into a technological sprint that its fragile, imitative and inefficient command economy could not sustain. The F-15 was a weapon, but its true victory was economic. It had exposed the rot at the core of the Soviet system, a system that could imitate, but could no longer innovate. The 10-year gap was not a statistic, it was a symptom. It was the fatal, hemorrhaging wound of a system that had reached its ideological limit. The failure of the MiG-29 and Su-27 to immediately and effectively counter the F-15 was a perfect microcosm of the failure of the entire Soviet state. The Cold War was, at its heart, a battle of ideas. It was a contest between two opposing philosophies of human and economic organization. The Soviet Union operated on a command economy. A centralized Politburo in Moscow dictated what would be built, how many, and by whom. It was a system built on brute force, on quotas, on 5-year plans. It was magnificent at imitation and mass production. If the state needed 10,000 tanks, the state got 10,000 tanks. If it needed to copy a B-29 bomber, it could produce a perfect bolt-for-bolt replica, the Tu-4. But the F-15 was not a product of imitation, it was a product of innovation. The Green Eye, the APG-63 radar, was not born because a minister in Washington demanded it. It was born from a sprawling, chaotic, and fiercely competitive ecosystem. It was funded by DARPA, an agency designed to pursue high-risk, high-reward ideas. It was built by Hughes Aircraft in a cutthroat competition against Westinghouse. Its digital processors were a direct result of a burgeoning private sector computer industry in a place called Silicon Valley, an industry that simply did not and could not exist in the Soviet Union. The F-15 was the child of intellectual and economic freedom. It was a flying testament to the power of a system that allowed its brightest minds to compete, to fail, and to innovate. The Soviet Union, faced with this, did the only thing its system knew how to do. It tried to copy it, but they were not just copying a piece of hardware. They were trying to copy a thought process that was alien to their entire ideology. They could reverse engineer the what, but they could not replicate the why or the how. They could steal the plans for the radar, but they couldn't steal the microchip industry needed to build it. They could build a powerful engine, but they couldn't build the digital control computers to make it efficient. They could build a sleek, acrobatic airframe, but they couldn't build the networked, data-sharing mind that made the airframe lethal. The MiG-29 was the ultimate expression of this ideological failure. It was a brute force answer to a surgical question. It was a superb analog machine in a world that had just become irrevocably digital. And for 10 years, that gap, that failure, was the defining, terrifying reality in the skies over Europe. The Cold War ended not with a climactic battle over the Fulda Gap, but with the weary, anticlimactic crumbling of a concrete wall in Berlin in 1989. The Soviet Union itself dissolved just 2 years later. It was a whimper, not a bang. But the verdict on the decade of technological dominance, the final, terrifying proof of the Green Eye's superiority, was yet to be delivered. The trial had been set, the evidence submitted. All that was left was the execution. That execution took place on the 19th of January 1991 in the night skies over Iraq. This was the ultimate demonstration. Saddam Hussein's Iraqi Air Force was the fourth largest in the world, and it was the Soviet Union's premier client. It was equipped with the very best export models of the Big Bet, the brand new, top-of-the-line MiG-29 Fulcrums and advanced MiG-25 Foxbats. This was the confrontation the world had waited 40 years to see. The American Eagle versus the Soviet-built MiG. It was not a fight, it was a massacre. Imagine an Iraqi pilot, Captain Jamil Sayhud, climbing into his MiG-29B. He is a good pilot, trained by the Soviets. He is confident. He is in the most advanced fighter his nation has ever possessed, the very machine designed to kill the F-15. He takes off into the darkness, his slot-back radar the flawed, copied N-19 scanning the sky. His scope is a mess of noise and ground clutter. High above, at 30,000 feet, is a wolf pack of F-15Cs from the 33rd Tactical Fighter Wing. Their pilots are not staring at raw radar data. They are looking at a god's-eye view of the entire battlefield, data linked from an E-3 AWACS orbiting safely hundreds of miles away. The AWACS controller sees Captain Sayhud's MiG the moment it leaves the runway. Wolf 05, you have a single bogey airborne Baghdad tracking north. The F-15C pilot, Captain Cesar Rico Rodriguez, doesn't even have to use his own radar. He flies in total electronic silence. He sees the Iraqi MiG as a symbolic triangle on his tactical display. He is the ghost from the Baltic, now perfected. Captain Sayhud, in his MiG, sees nothing. His warning receiver is silent. The sky is empty. Rodriguez gets the tone from the AWACS. Wolf 05, you are cleared to fire. Launch and leave. From over 20 miles away, in a black sky, from an enemy he cannot see and does not know is there, Rodriguez launches a single AIM-7 Sparrow missile. In Captain Sayhud's cockpit, the world ends in 2 seconds. His Berioza receiver suddenly screams not a search, not a lock, but the death tone of an active missile homing in. He has no time to bank, no time to dump flares, no time to even understand. The 88-pound warhead detonates, and the pride of the Soviet countermeasure program is vaporized by an invisible enemy. This scene was repeated, again and again. 2 nights earlier, Captain Steve Tater Tate, in his F-15C, had detected a low-flying Iraqi Mirage F-1. The look-down system, which had so horrified the Soviets in 1976, was now so refined that Tate could track and kill the French-built fighter as it hugged the desert floor, an act of contempt that Captain Zuyev would have recognized instantly. The final verdict was written in fire. During Operation Desert Storm, United States Air Force F-15Cs were credited with 34 confirmed air-to-air kills. The number of F-15Cs lost to enemy aircraft, 0. The 10-year gap had been real. The Big Bet was a failure. The Green Eye had won. The legacy of the F-15 is not just in its unmatched kill ratio. Its legacy is that it broke the will of an empire. It was a weapon that so perfectly and ruthlessly exposed the central flaw of its adversary that it helped accelerate its collapse. It proved that a military built on brute force and imitation cannot compete with one built on innovation and information. The F-15 was the first true information warrior, a flying computer that valued data over speed and situational awareness over sheer numbers. When the Berlin Wall fell, it was a political act. but the sledgehammers that brought it down had been forged, in part, in the electronics labs of Hughes Aircraft and the engine bays of Pratt & Whitney. The F-15 was the military and technological sledgehammer that had been pounding on the cracks in the Soviet system for a decade. Today, new fighters take to the sky. But the F-15 Eagle, in its advanced new forms, still flies, its fundamental design still dominant nearly 50 years later. It is a silent, orbiting sentinel, a reminder of a verdict that was rendered in the cold, dark skies over the Baltic and confirmed in the fiery nights over Baghdad. It is the lasting symbol of an idea that, in the great brutal contest of the 20th century, proved Tob, in the end, invincible.